the Indo-American century. One of the defining relationships of the 21st century will be that between India and the United States. Having overcome the hesitations of history, the world's oldest and largest democracies have finally embraced each other in pursuing stronger ties across defense, trade, science, and many other spheres. However, for the partnership to escape the trap of empty rhetoric and truly deliver, it must be guided by a cohesive vision. Such a vision must outline the most consequential areas of cooperation, which maximize the returns for both partners and the world at large. The dragon in the room. The most immediate force accelerating this relationship, and its most pressing challenge, is the rise of China. It is true that there are deeper areas of common ground such as shared democratic values, but this was true throughout the Cold War, yet relations remained estranged. China's rise is the key catalyst in overcoming those hesitations of history, and managing it is the area in which U.S. and Indian interests most closely align. The U.S. increasingly views China as the most consequential threat to its national security. Technological competition between the two in fields such as artificial intelligence and quantum computing is fierce. While greater Chinese assertiveness in East and Southeast Asia impacts U.S. treaty allies such as Japan and the Philippines, India faces its own border dispute with China, which in 2020 saw violence for the first time in 45 years. India must also contend with Chinese efforts to cultivate influence in the Indian Ocean region through its string of pearl strategy. Most critical is the potential threat of war over Taiwan, whose impacts will be global and catastrophic. Even without war, Chinese economic domination of Asia would mean control over the world's most consequential markets, as Asia today accounts for 46% of global GDP. PPP. With Asia's global weight set to rise even more in the coming years, neither the U.S. nor India can afford to have terms dictated to them in this region. As in 1972, when Nixon opened relations with China to undermine the Soviets. It is again in the U.S. interest to deepen relations with India and to cultivate it as a counterweight to China. A more economic and militarily powerful India can prevent China from focusing its full attention on the Western Pacific. Likewise, India also needs the U.S. engaged to keep China occupied. A U.S. focused on Asia and the Pacific will prevent China from dominating India in the Himalayas. In this way, a U.S.-India partnership can bind China in a two-front conundrum. Here, we must note that India and the U.S. will never be formal treaty allies. Unlike countries in Europe or East Asia, India is simply too large and independent to subsume its military and freedom of action under an American Supreme Allied commander. This means that just as the U.S. isn't directly involved in the India-China border conflict, so too would India not take direct part in a Taiwan conflict. Despite this, cooperating with India is still in the U.S. interest, simply because it has more military capacity than any other traditional U.S. ally. According to GFP, India ranks fourth in military strength after the U.S., Russia, and China. Its strength is projected to rise as India remains the world's top arms importer, as illustrated by its recent purchase of 31 MQB Sea Guardian drones from the U.S. India's growing military capacity means that, unlike traditional U.S. allies, it is capable of defending itself and also projecting power. This capacity sets the stage for a more flexible and reciprocal type of cooperation. For instance, the U.S. has provided intelligence on Chinese troops on the Himalayan border. India could reciprocate by taking a greater role in providing security in the Indian Ocean to free up U.S. resources for East Asia. Such arrangements are win-win and don't require lumbering formal alliance commitments, trade, and mutual prosperity. Beyond the immediate challenges posed by China, over the long term, both the U.S. and India stand to gain from deeper economic cooperation. This is again a win-win situation. India, owing to structural reforms, is today the world's fastest-growing major economy. However, it still requires extensive investment to fuel its economic growth, which the U.S. can provide. A critical part of this from India's perspective is technology transfer to accelerate modernization. Like the agreement to jointly produce F-414 fighter jet engines between GE and Hindustan Aerospace, the U.S. can become a leading investor in India's economic rise, following the footsteps of its Quad partner Japan. On the other side, the U.S. needs partners to implement its economic de-risking strategy and decouple supply chains from China. India will form a key component of this, as it is the only economy that can remotely hope to compete with China in size. From the perspective of the private sector, the opportunity to enter the vast Indian consumer market while hedging geopolitical risk from China is a great opportunity. So far, Apple's increasing manufacturing footprint in India is the best example of this. Nor can U.S. investors looking for returns in an uncertain world ignore Indian markets. One curious feature of China's rise is how little of the value created was relayed to investors. Since 2000s, China's GDP has grown by roughly 18 times. Over that same period, the benchmark Shanghai Composite Index has only doubled, while the Hang Seng Index is mostly unchanged. Compare this with India, where GDP has grown by 8 times, while the benchmark SENSEX Index has grown by 16 times. Just recently, the Indian stock market overtook Hong Kong's to become the world's 4th largest. As Indian growth accelerates and India inserts itself into global value chains, Indian markets will look increasingly attractive to U.S. investors. Open societies and civilizational exchange. The above spheres are pragmatic areas of cooperation which make sense as long as interests are aligned. However, a less transactional and ultimately more powerful dimension will be the organic people-to-people cultural exchange between these two countries. When asked what the greatest political fact of modern times was, Otto von Bismarck is said to have noted the inherited and permanent fact that North America speaks English. In this century, one could say that the analog is the fact that India speaks English. To be sure, only approximately 10% of Indians speak English, but that itself is about 140 million people, easily making it the 2nd largest English-speaking population in the world. This number will only rise as Indians get richer and learn English to improve their economic prospects. Crucially, English fluency is much higher amongst the elites who shape culture and politics. For example, it is easy to find Indian politicians delivering speeches and engaging in debates with a command of English better than many native Anglophones. The presence of English, particularly among the elites, makes it exponentially easier for Americans to interact with and learn about India. It also makes it easy for Indians to plug themselves into the global exchange of ideas and make their voice heard. Contrast this with China, where less than 1% or only about 20 million speak English. It is no surprise then why America was purely an economic relationship with little cultural exchange. By contrast, a shared language can allow India-America to develop a genuine cultural element. A shared language is necessary, but not sufficient for cultural exchange. Crucially, unlike China, India is also an open society, which is the second prerequisite. Indians are not isolated behind a great firewall. They are on the same open internet as everyone. Nor are they muzzled by an omnipotent state, as a look at the chaotically vibrant Indian press will show. Indian media is widely and easily available for anyone who wants a glimpse into Indian culture, in contrast with Chinese culture, which is closely guarded by the Communist Party of China. Americans require Mandarin-fluent seers to interpret the propaganda that filters through the Great Firewall, just to get a glimmer of Chinese public sentiment. By contrast, they can have a front seat to foundational civilizational debates of contemporary India simply through a YouTube search, without needing to learn any new languages. This means that just as American ideas and culture have been absorbed by a non-trivial proportion of Indians, so too Indian ideas can be easily absorbed by Americans. As India grows richer, interest in it will naturally rise, which will facilitate this exchange. Unlike with China, democratic India's rise will be raucous, chaotic, and transparent for all to see and engage with. The importance of India and the U.S. being open societies with a shared language cannot be overstated. What makes this especially powerful is that both countries fundamentally belong to different civilizations. This means that their openness and shared language can act as a conduit for a grand civilizational exchange of ideas. Just as India has been introduced to ideas from Western civilizations such as habeas corpus, so too has the West. Learned about ideas from Indian civilization like yoga and karma. As the relationship deepens, such exchange will also deepen. It is for this reason that both countries should prioritize people-to-people contact. This may be the first time in modern history that the conditions are ripe for such a civilizational exchange of ideas between the leading and a rising power. At the turn of the 20th century, Britain and the U.S. both shared language, but were part of the same civilization. At the turn of the 21st, the U.S. and China shared neither language nor civilization. The U.S. and India share language, yet represent different civilizations. Vitally, both are free societies open to new ideas. The potential for a grand cross-pollination of ideas, catalyzed by forces like the Indian diaspora in the U.S. and the open internet, is truly unquantifiable. More than the compulsions of shared security threats and economic imperatives, this will be the undercurrent that binds the American and Indian people in a lasting manner. Even though India and the U.S. will never be treaty allies, there is no doubt that they are natural allies. While the rise of China is the immediate catalyst for bringing these two countries together, there are more positive longer-term structural reasons that make the partnership sustainable. The immense potential for mutual economic prosperity is one. The strong people-to-people ties, marked by shared values and open societies, is another. Over time, common values, cultural exchange, and booming trade will pick up the baton from Chinese aggression in ensuring that the India-US partnership becomes one of the defining relationships of the 21st century.